Hello and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. In this episode, you'll hear a discussion exploring innovative approaches to rehabilitation that reduce reoffending and drive social impact. The discussion was recorded on the 18th of March and chaired by Jess Bowie, Editor-in-Chief of Civil Service World.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Civil Service World webinar. I'm Jess Bowie, co-editor of CSW, and the theme of today's conversation is Unlocking Rehabilitation, Innovative Solutions with Social Impact. We have a great panel, each of whom will share their experience and insights on this fascinating topic. So do please take advantage of their expertise and submit your questions using the chat function on your screen. You can also upvote questions from other attendees. So if there's something that you'd like to see answered that somebody else has already asked, do give that the thumbs up and we will keep an eye on that. As I said, I'm very lucky to be joined today by four experts, and they are in alphabetical order. Alice Adamson, Deputy Director for Rehabilitation Strategy and Interventions at His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. Des Brown, CEO and founder of the award-winning charity Spark to Life. David Dado, Governor of Hoathly Bay. And Natalie Parrott, Psychological Services Director for Serco Prisons in the UK. And Serco are also the sponsors for this event. So thank you, Serco, for enabling us to come together this morning. I'd like to start the conversation by asking our panel to introduce themselves properly. Firstly, Alice, can you tell us a bit more about your work and your background?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Alice, as Jess mentioned. I am a career civil servant who has done a number of years in the justice sector, more than I probably wish to count. But actually I've only been on the prison and probation side of things for the last 3 years. I am responsible for HMPPS's rehabilitation strategy. I'm also responsible for all of the kind of relational parts of rehabilitation in the organisation. So in particular, chaplaincy, psychological interventions, and also families and relationships with significant others. I'm also responsible within my portfolio, broader strategy portfolio, for relationships with the third sector and lived experience. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you, Alice. I'll turn to Des next. Des, how did you come to be sitting on a panel discussing rehabilitation?
Okay, well, hi everyone. And as I've been introduced, my name's Des. Well, apart from obviously being invited, it's based on my role within Spark to Life, which stands for Showing Positive and Relevant Keys to Life. I'm a founder of the charity, but I'm also somebody who's gone through the criminal justice system many years ago now, going back in the 90s. So the whole kind of journey and process of rehabilitation is very kind of close to my heart. I've kind of, through the lived experience, been on a journey. I became an ordained minister, having come out of prison for a serious violent offence, actually, of sadly taking somebody's life for manslaughter. But once I became an ordained minister, I then went back in and became a chaplain, a sessional chaplain in prison, and also studied as a therapist in one of the London prisons, doing my hours, as it were. And again, just wanting to support and help those that are in prison to rehabilitate. The charity that I run, we work across 10 boroughs. We work with what we would deem medium to high risk offenders, get referrals from probation, youth offending team, primarily age group 11 to 30. We do stuff with parents. We have therapy as well for our workers. We have about 10 of our workers of 30 that are reformed offenders. And yeah, we work with schools as well on a preventative model. As they say, prevention is better than cure. There's often a conversation between the prison, school exclusion to kind of prison pipeline. We want to stop that. And also speaking truth to power when it comes to issues of racial injustice. And I think there's disproportionalities when we look at issues to do with stop and search, school exclusion, prison incarceration, and mental ill health. And so we find ourselves in a space to speak into that. So I wear various hats, but I'm here today as the CEO of Spark to Life and happy to contribute.
Thank you so much, Des. Natalie, next. what first got you interested in rehabilitation, and what kind of work do you do now?
So, yes, good morning, everyone. Lovely to join you today. I guess I first got interested in rehabilitation really through university. So doing a degree in psychology and criminal justice. So that involves lots of history, but also up to the contemporary approaches to rehabilitation, and taking it from there, really. I've been working in different prisons and secure mental health hospitals across both private and public sectors for nearly 25 years now. So what I do now in my position in Serco is providing the strategic leadership and the clinical governance for the psychology and offending behaviour programmes that we run in our prisons, as well as that includes things like the therapeutic communities that we have, as well as all the individual work and research that we do in psychology. So yes, what I enjoy really is the consultation work that I get involved with on psychological matters to the senior leadership across justice and immigration, and working with both the staff and the prisoners in our care. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And last but not least, David, tell us a bit about your career in the prison service.
Good morning. My name's David Daddo. I joined HMPPS in 1995, which feels like a long time ago. And for those that remember that far back, it was the same year that Robinson and Jerome were outselling Oasis and Take That in the charts, and petrol cost 53 pence a litre. I digress. Since then, and during my 30-year operational career, I've worked within prisons and HQ roles in Leicester, Dorset, Devon, London, Kent and Suffolk. And that's working in Category A to YY, Cat C, Cat D, open prison as my last one. And I'm currently very proud to govern HMP Hoathly Bay in Suffolk, which is a Cat D training and resettlement prison. I've been here for 4 years. But next month, I'll move on to govern HMP The Mount, Cat C training and resettlement prison in Hertfordshire.
Great, and thank you for that trip down memory lane. I wish I couldn't remember that, but I do, sadly. Well, what a great panel. Thank you, guys. So we've got a few talking points for today's discussion. And the first of them is, what does tailored rehabilitation look like? And I'm going to go to Des first for that one. And tell us what it looks like from your vantage point in the voluntary sector.
Yeah, great question. I think what we have endeavoured to do, and what I think the conversation often around the sector, especially in the voluntary sector, is looking at being person-centred. So it's whether people will call it kind of client-focused, person-centred. So it's about the individual. Because obviously everyone's journey is different, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. So when we're thinking about prisons, we're thinking about probation, and we're thinking about that journey of rehabilitation. For me, it's very much around being able to identify the different support needs within that individual. And, you know, there's so many different things, I think, when we look at evidence base, whether it's accommodation is really important around rehabilitation. So there's some kind of quick wins we can think about, whether it's be, you know, training or employment and education, again, is a quick win in regards to being able to help those individuals achieve and do well. And that's all part and parcel of someone's journey on rehabilitation. But I think one of the big things we look at when we look at therapeutic casework or therapeutic mentoring, as we would call it within Spark to Life, is very much around people's values and the way they see the world. And that's what makes it a little bit more person-centered, because I think, you know, we all have a worldview. We all see things in different ways. We all have different experiences. And I think more often than not, depending on someone's upbringing and, you know, thinking of adverse childhood experiences, and I think there's a lot of evidence to say for those that are incarcerated and within our prisons and or on probation, more often than not, there's stuff that's happened in their lives. And I think the kind of the trauma lens is not what have you done, it's what's happened to you. And so it's trying to focus on the stuff that people may have gone through. And so we kind of look very much at what is someone's values, what is right and wrong in their world. And a lot of that will determine their behaviour and their whole kind of belief system. And that's quite important, I think, when we're looking at rehabilitation, because it's not just, okay, getting an accommodation, okay, getting a job, doing education, etc. It's also about how somebody's feeling, how somebody sees themselves. And so the kind of therapeutic side of working with somebody on that is the internal work. And prison's one of those places, probably less so than probation, where you have a lot of time to think. I mean, I was in Pentonville yesterday, a ceremony or a celebration to recognise people that had done a programme called Time for Change. It's 18 to 25-year-olds. And a lot of that was about them being able to reflect on questions they're being asked about how they see offending behaviour, what will happen when they get out, how they think about issues of disproportionality, etc. And all of that is part and parcel of the rehabilitative process. And my final point on all of that would be, I think, as well as about journeying with somebody, that significant other, that trusted adult, etc. And, you know, the system's not always well placed to do that because it works somewhat in silos. But I think the voluntary sector has a good opportunity to do a kind of through the gate process of working with somebody in prison and then also when they go out, because I think relationships are really important, especially when you're trying to look at that journey of rehabilitation. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I can say, but that's kind of in a nutshell how we think and approach it.
Great, thank you so much, Des. I'm sure we'll touch on lots of those themes later in the conversation as well. Before I ask Natalie the same question, I just realised there's a piece of housekeeping that I forgot to include earlier, which is that if anybody is having any technical difficulties with anything, please do contact us at events@civilserviceworld.com. And our team should be able to help you. So yes, Natalie, I think you have got some, I'm sure you've got some thoughts about what tailored rehabilitation looks like. And can you talk us through what a strengths-based approach means?
Sure. Yeah. So I think rehabilitation in prisons particularly, but also in probation, has been on a bit of its journey itself. Certainly in my career, when I first started, we would always talk about someone's risks, or what their risk needs are, or their criminogenic needs. It was all about the things that were a deficit, or seen as a deficit. And over the years, we really moved towards a strengths-based approach, touching on what Des was saying just then, you know, thinking about what someone's strengths are, what are their protective factors, how can we enhance those in the work that we do around rehabilitation. And I think you can't do that in isolation. There wouldn't be one size fits all, because everybody is different. We're all different to each other. We have our own personalities, we have our own history. And so taking a really holistic view of the people who are in prison and what they bring, what their life history is, can really help tailor what the appropriate intervention or the appropriate work would be for them. So that will be around something to do with psychology. It could be offending behaviour programmes. It could be the work we do in therapeutic communities at Dovegate, and we'll be opening one soon in Ashfield for people convicted of sexual offences. Those types of intervention really do take the person as a whole, and looking at what their education has been, what we can do to increase those skills, or what their understanding of themselves is and their victims, or how they've approached life in lots of different ways with their family and their support. So yeah, I think really a strengths-based approach is one where you look at what people value, what they do well in. We could use the Good Lives model developed by Tony Ward in that to look at someone's holistic support mechanisms, and working with that and enhancing that and moving that forward in their rehabilitative journey.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And David, what does tailored support look like in open prisons?
I think similar to what Des started with about everyone being treated as individual, they've got individual needs. And as an open prison, our focus, talking very generic, overall, overarching, is about training and resettlement services in preparation for return to society. So all we do is focused around that. And my prison specifically, Hoseley Bay, is a large open prison, the capacity of 655. And we have an integrated ACOSO, that's people convicted of sexual offences, population, who live alongside and work alongside our general population of people with determinate and indeterminate sentences, and spending up to 3 years in our community. So we've got quite a good amount of time for the majority of our population to work with them. We've got no fence, no physical security, and it covers 85 acres and has a public road running through the centre of it. The openness, though, it's an enabler to build trust. And that leads to our population learning to self-govern their behaviours, which is a great help and stepping stone through to release back into society. We've got a golden thread that runs through the centre of that is ROTL, release on temporary licence, which is a huge asset to us, particularly in the open estate, where we use that primarily to work in 3 areas, one of which is the first one. ROTL, a frustration with ROTL can be for many that it takes 3 to 6 months to progress to ROTL. So using people's time purposefully at the start of their sentence in the open estate is really important. So we focus on training. And the first part of that, while we're working towards ROTL board, is looking at education, functional skills, English, maths and IT, settling people into the estate. And then that leads on to the opportunities that build within vocational qualifications in an area that they would like to work when they get released. And that can be typically construction, catering, hospitality, horticulture or transport. They're the main areas that we focus on. And Hoseley Bay works with 34 different employers who employ people in the local community in voluntary or paid work opportunities that leads to ROTL's work experience, building social capital in preparation for release. A really, really important one, though, that comes with the open estate, comes in all prisons, but for us, we value, and particularly around ROTL, is family and significant others. So building on social bonds in society prior to release creates that support structure in readiness for release back into society. And ROTL provides us that opportunity to provide a regime that's progressive and purposeful in that access. So we slowly reintegrate people through resettlement day release to overnight release that enables them to reconnect with families. And that can be really important when we think of really significant times in their families' lives where a bereavement or the birth of a child can be really significant events that they need to demonstrate support and be a part of it. So we can do that. And that's a huge asset with ROTL. The final element, or one element that we cover that's really important, is housing. So in the last 12 weeks of our priority for all resettlement prisons is about enabling them to have accommodation, secure accommodation to be released to back in society prior to release. It's very difficult to secure work, employment and reconnect with family if you don't know where you're living. So that's a huge priority for us. But the way we deliver those priorities of training, employment, connected to families and housing, we do it through a sequenced journey. So we have a sequenced journey through custody at Hoseley Bay, where ROTL is a key incentive, encourages positive behaviours within our estate. Stage 1 for us, whilst we go through the ROTL process, is all about functional skills. To achieve a level 1 in functional skills means you're ready to start vocational courses at level 2 or 3, or access Open University or university college places out in society. Stage 2, after you've completed that level 1, we move to a vocational offer where we cover courses that align to their ambitions for release, which are in those areas of construction, catering, hospitality, horticulture, transport. That enables us to have 3 to 6 months whilst we're working for a ROTL board where ROTL is opened up. And ROTL is a significant driver within the open estate. And about 50% of our population are accessing ROTL at any one time. And that gives them access to their family on day release and overnight release. It gives them the opportunity to work in the community and engage in society. Stage 4, our final stage, is about release planning. And as I said previously, that's where a fantastic team work with helping people to prepare a CV, apply for a bank account, apply for jobs, secure housing. And for those few that don't have housing secured before they get released, we drive them to their first housing appointment. And I think just for the final point, I wanted to say that there's some really fantastic research that's been done over the last few years. And some research by the MOJ in 2015 found that those who went through a staged, individualised pathway through temporary release for employment or training were half as likely to reoffend than those who didn't access ROTL. And there was a follow-up research by Hillier and Muse in 2018, which I can share in the chat, that found that there was a 0.5% reduction of the odds of reoffending for each day release in the community. And they found that there was a 5% reduction of reoffending for each overnight release on ROTL. So I think the evidence is there to say that ROTL and the approach that can be adopted in the open state is something of great value to the MOJ and to individuals.
Thank you, David. That's really interesting. Alice, I want you to be a good Whitehall civil servant now and talk about the HMPPS's rehabilitation strategy and how it takes account of different people's journeys through the criminal justice system. And also, if you can all touch on people for whom, how rehabilitation works for those for whom open prisons and rottle just aren't yet an option, that would be really interesting to get that perspective as well. So I think the original point, Alice, was tailored rehabilitation. But yes, sorry, I'll stop rambling. Go.
No, that's fine. And actually, I was going to say something on that point, but not actually about prisons, about probation. So I won't cover what colleagues have said, but you know, our kind of strap line for the rehab strategy is right person, right approach, right time, because that is absolutely critical, that whole kind of person-centered, strengths-based. But also I think we in the system get into a bit of a habit about talking about resettlement, and you know, somebody's journey is kind of standard: start in prison, hopefully move to open prison, come out, be under probation. But of course, lots of people's journeys are not like that. They come into the system at multiple points. They may have probation only in their experience, but the sort of needs they have as an individual might be the same wherever they are in the system. So it's about how you kind of meet those. The addition that I would put on, I think, has come through in what other people have said, but I just wanted to bring out, was the kind of relational element of what we do and how important that is to rehabilitation. So a few colleagues have spoken about families. We have a reoffending study that shows that people in prison who received visits were 39% less likely to reoffend than those who didn't. You know, the power of that social contact, but that social contact might be that relationship that gives somebody hope and supports them in their desire to change, might be someone who is already in their life. It might be someone new in their life, so that might be their prison officer, their probation officer, or it might be someone in the third sector that's working directly with them. And that is something that we can all do in our jobs, is that kind of relational role, whether we've got a kind of specific focus on working with someone on their accommodation, or delivering an offending behaviour programme, or delivering another sort of intervention. Actually, it's not always the thing that you're doing, it's often the person that you are, and the hope that you can give in that process.
Thank you very much, Alice. So I think that's everyone, isn't it, on that topic. We've got two kind of discussion points around prison staff, so I'm going to roll them together, and I'm going to ask panelists to address either or both in their answers. And I'll go to Natalie first with this one, and then anyone who wants to come in afterwards can. So it's how a trauma-informed and psychologically aware environment empowers prison staff to design effective rehabilitation programs. And then the other point, sort of part B, is ensuring rehabilitation strategies have a positive impact on prison officers and staff.
Yeah, so two really good areas to highlight here, I think. And it's, you know, partly what do we mean by trauma informed or trauma aware. I think sometimes we can use these terms without maybe thinking about what we mean. And it's coming back to what I was saying earlier, knowing someone's history or being aware that people have a history. And I'm talking about prison staff as well as prisoners, anyone working or living in a prison, really. The environment can be absolutely critical, and there's some work that we've been doing recently looking at how environment can be intervention, and that by that I mean supportive of the rehabilitative work that we focused on in prisons, or actually working against it and being much more mindful and aware of the environments within which we work and prisoners live. So I think starting from the beginning, Alice mentioned there, we have some focus on the resettlement at the end, but actually the settlement into prison at the beginning is really, really important, and how that beginning part for a prisoner coming into the reception area right at the start, how they're received by the prison staff, can have a huge impact on the engagement that they have through the rest of their journey, and managing risk in those early days. So I think the prison staff are crucial, and I'm going to come to that second point you asked there around how rehabilitative strategies can have a positive impact on prison staff. So some of the work we've been doing over recent years in the Serco prisons have been around the training that our psychologists have given to the prison officers, and that's really to upskill, to increase knowledge, to increase empowerment and understanding. So I won't list them all, but things like understanding rehabilitative culture, what we mean by that in our prisons and how we can embody that, what offence paralleling behaviour might look like. And so as they're doing their work as key workers, they can pick up on areas that they want to emphasise and those strengths we want to build, or other areas that could be concerning and need addressing in the prisoner's rehabilitative journey. And also we do some training about responsivity to age. So the age of a prisoner and their brain development has a huge impact on how they or how officers can interact with them and how they can interact with officers. And if we're aware of how to interpret behaviour, then we can again be far more supportive. So all of this can have very positive impacts on staff, I think, when they feel empowered. And we know from research that empowerment and support for officers to feel like they're doing a good job makes a big difference. But equally, if they don't have that support and empowerment, then it can lead to areas around emotional exhaustion. And we do quite a lot of research in our prisons to monitor the well-being of officers, which then leads into a lot of work that's been done by one of my colleagues and her team in terms of the well-being of staff in our prisons, because again that all comes back to the prison culture of how people feel when they're living and they're working in a prison environment. It can be very stressful, you can feel quite unsafe at times. So being aware of how the environment supports the rehabilitative culture and the rehabilitative work that we're doing includes how we think about staff, how we think about the prisoners living there.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Does anyone else want to come in on prison staff?
May I just briefly, Jess, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
So we have a programme underway in HMPPS looking at how we recruit our staff and how we train them when they're in, and sort of reviewing practices. I think that is a really important thing for us, because we were understaffed for a large period of time. We've got quite a new workforce, people who've come in since the pandemic and don't necessarily know what it's like working in busy prisons where the regime is, quite open, and that new programme is focused on what are called enabling environments, which are a model that is approved by, I'm going to get the name of this wrong, but British psychiatrist, I'm going to get the name wrong. Basically, it's a well-known psychiatric model for creating kind of psychologically safe spaces. And that's the driving force behind the change. But it's also looking at things like, where can we bring lived experience in earlier, so that people who are coming into the system to work here understand the individuals that they are working with and understand that they are people before they're understanding, how to lock a door and how to manage kind of trouble when it plays out. Actually, it's really important for people to be able to understand the individuals they are working with as human beings as their starting point. That is quite a big shift in the way that we do things, I think. And there are brilliant people working in our prisons and in probation who come in with the right attitudes, but there are some people who come in who don't really understand the environment. That's the thing that we need to accept. And so kind of building that relational element right from the start is going to be really critical for us.
That's really interesting, Alice. Thank you. And Des has got his hand up. David has got two hands up. So I won't forget to come to you, David, I promise. But Des, I'll go to you next on staff.
Yeah, just a few things. I think one is reverse mentoring. I know there's a lot of programs now, even within the prisons, but also outside for new trainee officers, where you'll get individuals that have gone through the criminal justice system that are then offering them a lens or a viewpoint from what it's like to be in a prison as a resident, and the kind of the way that they feel they can be approached or treated. And so I think that's really helpful for prison staff. I think one of the things that, again, is somewhat idealistic, but I think would be helpful is clinical supervision. I think, especially group, I mean, it's quite idealistic to get one-to-one, but I think there's a real need, especially for prison officers, to be able to unpack some of the stuff that they have seen going through. Because, we talk about being trauma aware and trauma informed. I think the trauma informed is more around policy, and how many people within prisons are trauma responsive. And I think this kind of leads a little bit onto chaplaincy, because I think chaplains are more often than not the kind of neutral party within a prison regime, as in they're there to serve the residents, but also there to serve the officers, especially where there's moments of crisis. And that's not necessarily being faith specific, but it's being able to create a safe space for individuals that are processing, a hard day, trauma, a loss, death. I mean, the list goes on, as we all know, because prisons are full of people that are going through life. And, more often than not, I think we have to give a shout out to those chaplains that have to manage that, having been one historically. But I do feel that, we've got to think not just programs, and I think it's been alluded to, we've got to think about the environments. And that's quite hard, because for those that have been in prisons, and I can name a number of ones that I've been in, it's quite hard to think, how can that become a therapeutic environment? Because it's just complete and utter chaos at times that's happening, and so much is going on. But I think that's why it comes down to the relationships between the staff, the relationships between the residents, and trying to nurture that and be intentional about that. And again, without being too disingenuous to the officers, but the power lies with the governors, the officers, to really start that process. And it's easier said than done. But I think if the officers of the wings, the prisons, can really carry that culture, I think it can make a massive impact within the prisons.
Well, your mention of governors segues nicely onto David. So let's hear from the governor.
Well, I mean, Des has actually covered quite a lot of the bits I was going to say. It's absolutely on the same page. I think, first of all, just focusing on, it's an incredibly challenging environment, the prison. If I'm thinking at staff in that first instance, it could be mentally and emotionally draining. I think the reference of supervision is something that we need to work on and do better. But also, it's mentally and emotionally challenging for our community as well. And the ethos I've always had is about people. We're all people, whether it's prisoner, member of staff, senior manager, stakeholder, partner agencies that will work together. We're all people. The most important part is that relationship that we have together, and then that builds a positive, or can build a positive community. And I think for me, as a governor, the priority has always been that we have to create hope and opportunity. And that's hope and opportunity for our community, prisoner community, but also for our staffing group, to see that there's a real purpose to what they're doing, that they're making an impact. And actually, as soon as by sharing your priorities so that your community and your staffing group both understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we're working towards, does create a purpose that people can buy into. And I think you only get that through inclusion. You only get that by talking to each other. And that's not just on key work. That's as a senior manager having a prisoner council that's democratically elected, that we can learn from the views from the ground within the prison, and then adapt our way of working to make sure we are considering their needs. And our modelling for the regime is researched and as included all partner agencies, including prisoners, community, staff, stakeholders.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on to the next discussion point, if I may. In about 10 minutes, we're going to have questions from the audience. So do get your question in if you haven't. It is about I consider perhaps we don't have to dwell too long on this, because I think a lot of the people who are tuning in from home or from the office into this webinar are from the MOJ or the MOJ family. But I think it's really interesting to explore what the lessons are from, because rehabilitation is such a multi-agency effort, multi-sector. And, you know, it is an example of where, you know, silos are broken down. You've got work coaches collaborating with prison officers and all this kind of stuff. And you've got DWP involved. You've got multiple departments have a sort of stake in this. And so I was wondering what other parts of government can learn, other officials who are tackling comparable wicked problems, what they can learn from the collaborative approach in rehabilitation. And anyone who wants to go first on that can.
Shall
Alice?
I go first
Yeah.
as the cross Whitehall person, and then other people might have another perspective? So we have been working, I think, really well with other departments because, as you say, it's necessary. I think the big challenges around accommodation and employment can only be resolved by working directly with the experts. Homelessness in particular is a massive challenge where we have both invested our own money, but, you know, we have to be able to work with MHCLG. Are they still called MHCLG? I can't keep track of the acronyms in Whitehall, but also with local authorities, with the charitable sector. You know, you can't solve a problem like homelessness on your own, is the simple answer to that. But I think there are also real opportunities. I mean, again, I'd talk about MHCLG, but if you're looking at multiple disadvantage, the cohort of people that you have in prisons are absolutely the cohort who are affected by multiple disadvantage. So there's real opportunity to come together. There's a really interesting piece of work going on with one of our third sector partners, Revolving Doors, who are doing some analysis looking at the revolving door cohort, so people that are really kind of in and out of prison for a really long time, and looking at the evidence of like where different interventions would have made a difference to their outcome. And when you think about the kind of cost to society of reoffending, that kind of holistic look at the way of doing things is really critical. Another area that I think is really important for us is in the health space, again, where, you know, the NHS and HMPPS work absolutely in partnership. I think that's been really successful in the OPD space. So looking at personality disorders and the kind of way that has been set up both in prisons and the flow through into the community, where we have psychologically informed approved premises, so what people may know as bail hostels, I think was the old term, so that people can properly transition through and have that continuity of care. And the same thing has to absolutely apply for people's treatment for substance misuse too. Now, I've said lots of things that sparked other hands, so I will be quiet and let others come in.
I'm now realising that the hands, I don't think it's that people are putting two hands up. I think it's just the order. This shows how inexperienced in teams I am. So David, your hand was the first to go up. Go for it.
Okay, I was just following on from what Alice has said. I think when I first joined, we were a very closed community, and I don't think we let people in to try and help and support us. I think more recently we've started to learn the benefit from an approach to be more inclusive. And I've liked the interventions that have come from the employment advisory boards that have come in as people from the employment sector leading a conversation about informing us on what we need to be focusing on to deliver better outcomes, provide better opportunities, which has led to the inclusion of DWP around that table. And I can say, you know, from that as an example, DWP funded then HGV courses that led directly to employment on release for a number of our community, which was a huge success that we couldn't have otherwise provided. And then things like the Criminal Justice Board, which I've sat on several criminal justice boards, have now started opening their doors, providing support. And I've now seen them providing the offer of driver awareness courses for people that are doing external driving jobs for us, that may have been in custody for a long time and are not road savvy. for society now, which is a huge benefit to us. We wouldn't have had that if we didn't engage with other sectors. And then that very clear focus on reducing reoffending that's come with the introduction of ESWs, employment skills and work, and the PELs that lead to linking people to employability, and then our housing specialists as well for accommodation on release. I think we've started opening the door. We've started inviting the specialists in to provide us appropriate support. And I think we're getting better outcomes as a result of it.
Thank you, David. Des, and then I'll come to you, Natalie.
Yeah, I think for me, being a critical friend from the voluntary sector, looking at the way the system works, the only illustration that came to mind was, you think about, for those that are familiar with the underground system in London specifically, when it works, it's great. You know, if you can get from one train, go to the other, and you can think about each kind of coloured underground line as a service, whether it's, you know, mental ill health, substance misuse, housing, and the list goes on. I think what I feel often is needed is, when it's not working well, who's advocating and who's supporting the residents, and whether that's in prisons and or probation. And one of the things we feel is really important, especially when you're looking at those that may be deemed as more high risk offenders, for want of a better term, is having advocates. And being able to advocate for them, because we know that getting the right thing at the right time will highly reduce the probability of them reoffending or getting caught back into that kind of criminal behaviour. And so I feel that, you know, like a lot of systems, when they work well. But when you think about the need to interchange from, you know, one kind of Piccadilly line to the Northern line, from the Northern line, for those that aren't familiar with the London Underground, apologies, but I'm sure we're all kind of familiar. If you've played Monopoly, it might help. But just this whole thing around being able to move from one thing to the other. And I think that's really important, because, you know, having worked in prison, often some of the frustrations in prison and or on probation is helping people, and this is coming back to the whole rehabilitative point again, how do they communicate when things don't go well? How do they navigate the system when it's not working smooth? And for us that are on the outside setting it all up, it seems, I think we know deep down it's not simple, but it seems quite simple because these things exist. But having been within systems like prison and probation, and dealing with the lack of, at times, resources or personnel not being there, and we're talking about relationships and trusted adults and the importance of that, I think these can sometimes be the triggers for those that we want to support and help rehabilitate, that can sometimes send them left instead of keeping in a straight line. So hence the need to advocate, I think, is really important. And I just want to throw out there, just for our thoughts and our minds, one of the groups that we haven't talked about, which is really important, is those on remand. And there's a large number of them in our prisons, and they don't necessarily get the same service because they're on remand as those that have been sentenced. And that's just a thought, as they say.
No, that's really interesting. And I'm sorry, I'm not like completely au fait with all the terminology, but I think one of our questions we've had some great questions, which we'll go to after Natalie's had a chance to respond to all of that. I think one of our questions might address that. Natalie, over to you.
Yeah, so I'll be quite brief, because I agree with a lot of what's already been said by colleagues on the call here today. So really, sort of in my mind, summarising some of the things that are important if we think about lessons from when multi-agency efforts have worked well. And I think that comes down to communication, as Des was just saying. That it comes down to effective communication and being really transparent. So what is the driver here? What is our purpose of having these conversations and working together? When we have multi-agency meetings in prisons, it's often around people who have the highest pose the highest risk in an actuarial measure, and therefore seen to need the highest amount of input. what is the purpose? Who is the client here? What are the reasons? Being really clear on what the driver is and why we're working together. But yeah, communication and transparency. I think it links in with procedural justice principles as well, so that everyone involved knowing why something is happening, why a decision is being made, making decisions with everybody involved, and that includes the prisoners themselves. And I completely take your point there, Des, about people on remand. And I think often there are times, just to take a slight tangent, there are times where we can be more effective and inclusive of the prisoner when we're making decisions when people are on remand. But yeah, I think that there are lots of areas where this has worked well, and things have evolved over time. Alice mentioned the offender personality disorder pathway earlier, and that's something that I've seen really improve over the last number of years. Something that started quite small and almost felt to me, personally speaking, like, gosh, that's quite wishful thinking. How are we ever going to manage this? And now we've got a really embedded system where you have people from lots of different disciplines working together. When people are identified on that pathway, making sure that the prisoner at the heart of that has the right intervention at the right time, and that the staff working with them have the knowledge and the experience and the support from psychologists, whether that's inside prisons, or then it follows through when they go through the gate into probation and that service continues. So yeah, I think that transparency, communication, procedural justice principles are really key to that work.
Great, thank you very much for that, Natalie. I am going to go to audience questions. We've had sort of questions and some kind of thoughts shared, but they're really interesting. The first one is, busy local prisons are currently experiencing high levels of short sentences and fixed term recalls. We are unable to do anything meaningful in terms of rehabilitation or resettlement in 14 days, which in most cases is less than 14 days in custody. So I suppose that's probably not quite the same as on remand, but those short sentences, how do you tackle that? I know we've touched on that, and then I'll just put one more question out there, which for you guys to mull. So I work in prisons, and I feel that the men I work with are often talked at rather than with. Whilst prisons are improving communicating with prisoners, prisoner councils are more often made up of model prisoners. We need to ensure that all groups are heard, not just the easy ones. So Alice, you've got your hand up, and then I'll come to you, Natalie, again, if that's all right.
Natalie had her hand first, but don't worry. I am happy to pick that up, both of those points up. I think we're acutely aware of the challenges of short sentences. That's why one of the reasons why the sentencing review has been set up, and similarly the remand challenges, again, the Leveson review into what's going on in the criminal courts and how we can speed things up. I mean, just to give a kind of personal example, I mentor someone who is in prison on remand, went in July, still doesn't have a date for the court hearing. That is the reality that people are facing. Is that individual being supported in prison while they are there and experiencing rehabilitation? Absolutely. I guess they're in for quite a long time. That is whatever the results of the court case when it happens. On the challenge on people in 14 days, I absolutely agree. Resettlement, as we would call it, the kind of practical things are almost impossible to do in that time period. They're quite challenging to do if you've got 12 weeks, let alone 2. But rehabilitation is not impossible in that period. I think that's where we come back to the relational things that I was saying before. You might not be able to deliver a thing to somebody who's in for 2 weeks, but you can be that contact. You can be that person who's sort of giving them hope, asking them what's happening, what they're planning when they get out, how things are going to be different this time if they were recalled on a fixed term recall. What's their kind of, how are they making sure they've got the right relationship with their probation officer and can set that up properly? The point on kind of model prisoners and prisoner councils is really interesting. So for those people that are listening to this call who are from HMPPS, we have a lived experience charter in HMPPS that our leadership team are fully signed up to. And part of that charter commitment is how we hear the voice of people in our care, so whether they're in prison or on probation. For us, prisoner councils are sort of the minimum standards, and that's why actually how we engage people in peer-led activity as part of our tier 2 expectations in regime planning. Sorry, Jess, this is very HMPPS speak, and sorry to anyone who else is not from HMPPS on this call, but that actually building in the voice of those with lived experience is absolutely critical. And we're really clear that we shouldn't just be talking to those who are kind of demonstrating that they're doing really well and they're on enhanced and they're behaving and perhaps they've got a great job as an orderly. We need to hear from the people for whom prison is not working too. So if anyone ever wants to follow up with me on what we're doing in the lived experience space, I'd be really delighted to talk to them.
Thank you, Alice. Natalie.
Yeah, so thinking about those short sentences and those busy local remand prisons, I think I would advocate, I would give the message of holding the hope, that we can give hope to people, we can hold the hope that there is something that can be done in a short period of time. The big thing, there's lots of negatives to having your life disrupted and suddenly not being in community, but there's also some positives there as well. And if you are coming from somewhere that you really don't feel safe and is incredibly chaotic and you have no support and you are in fight mode all the time, coming into prison for 14 days could be the exactly what you need. You have structure, you're being cared for, and that's what we need to be doing in our prisons, and particularly in those local prisons, I think, and ensuring that people do feel safe. Coming back to that environmental thing, we want to create environments where even in those busy prisons, that there is some safety and there is some solitude as well when they're able to have their own space in their rooms. And I think also some of the key strategies that have come up today are about being person-centred. If you are coming into a prison, maybe for the first time, maybe it is a revolving door, but you have someone who listens to you in that reception space, in those early days centres, and they can think about you as a person and tailoring what you need for those 14 days. And there's also something around early intervention. Des spoke about this earlier, addressing things at the earliest possible point. Now, someone coming into prison have maybe missed some of the early interventions in schools with the work that you're doing with your company, Des. But actually, we have a contact point now. We have an opportunity, and I think having a supportive environment where people are seen as a person, they feel safe, and we have an opportunity to start those interventions now rather than when they're on a longer sentence. That I think is key in those local prisons.
David, very quickly,
Yeah,
if that's all right.
I'll be super quick. So I was just going to say prisoner council is one layer. Visibility of staff, managers, governors, and it is the first layer. Forums, surveys, questionnaires all lead into an informed view of an establishment. Prisoner council is the upper end of that tier, where you do need to encourage voice. You need to empower people to feel their voice will be heard, and that will encourage a more diverse group that would come on a prisoner council. But it starts much further down, and I agree with the point. It starts further down with engagement. It's not just prisoner council, and it's not just the willing. You've got to encourage all to speak up and listen.
Great, thank you. So we've probably got time for one more question before we do our kind of closing thoughts. There's a question here. To what extent do we learn from other countries when it comes to supporting the mental well-being of prison staff? For example, in America, prison and police staff will have automatic referrals and direct access to psychological services after traumatic experiences. Do we have something similar? And if not, what are the main challenges of implementing something similar?
So the good news is we do have something similar. So in HMPPS, and Natalie might want to talk about what happens in private prisons, our employee assistance programme is specifically contracted to be available to support staff who experience any sort of traumatic incident, and there is an expectation that they understand our context and are able to support staff both in prisons and on probation, because of course traumatic incidents often happen for probation staff too, particularly those who work in approved premises. But going back to the point Des made earlier, that is also what chaplaincy are here for, to provide that support. Oh, we lost Des. To provide that support for our staff, not just our prisoners, and they are particularly there for when things are really difficult, like deaths in custody.
Thank you, Alice. Hopefully we will get Des back. In the meantime, Natalie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so obviously I can't speak for all private prisons, but in Circa we have something very similar. We have an employee assistance programme. We also provide counselling service to all prison staff, but specifically around instant management and traumatic experiences. We have TRIM, which is a trauma risk management system. I think that's in public prisons as well, isn't it, Alice? Yeah. So this is a process by which you have aspects of trauma that could be individuals or it could be groups of colleagues, and you have an assessment, and then you have the support given by specially trained members of staff. So this is much it's away from thinking of trauma as a victim survivor kind of a system. It's more around traumatic events, and I think just taking a moment to consider that working in prisons can be both traumatizing and re-traumatizing for everybody involved. It's something that is a really important part of the support systems for all members of staff. Just briefly, additionally, in Circa, we have React, which is a training workshop that we deliver continually so you're away from a traumatic event. It's when you're in a calm space, but you can think about how you might respond. And the idea there is to increase mindfulness around situational awareness. But I'll stop there, Jess.
Thank you. And Des, before you dropped off the call, you had your hand up, and then we'll go into closing thoughts after that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Just a few thoughts. One's more of a radical thought, but the first one is, I mean, we offer therapy for our workers and for families and young people or young adults that have or going through the criminal justice system. And some of them are qualified therapists and some of them are trainee therapists. And with the trainee therapists, a lot of them have to go through quite a robust process of clinical supervision. They have to go through therapy themselves, and they have to do a lot of training as they are on their journey. And I think I'd encourage prisons to sign up or to find out where therapeutic training is happening and have a conversation with those centres, because you may find that actually you can provide staff with free therapy from those that are at their level 4 training as a therapist, and there's a lot of support around those therapists. So don't feel that they're not, therapy isn't about just qualification, it's actually about relationship, but that's a whole nother conversation. And so, yeah, I'd definitely encourage prisons to do that, because I think they could offer their staff that support. And one of my kind of final thoughts is, wouldn't it be good to get a pilot prison to train therapists in that prison at level 2 and level 3? And these are for service or residents, actually, but also for prison staff to be able to train as therapists as a kind of developmental and progression opportunity. And then they could potentially, once they qualify, be moved to a prison as a therapist. And just thinking of a few prisons to work together to have that as a model. Because I think what you'll then do by default is create a therapeutic environment. And then you could also create a therapeutic wing within the prisons where people actually are learning how to converse. They're learning all about the kind of the therapeutic key principles. And I think you'll find it will change the culture of a prison. As I said before, just a thought.
Thank you very much. So you've each got about 30 seconds probably for your closing thought. And I normally ask for kind of either one action from each panelist that they think audience members could go and do to take forward the rehabilitation agenda, or you could tell me what you thought was the most interesting thing from today's conversation. So I am going to go to David first for that.
Right. Thank you. I think for me, something I'm focused on, which I really enjoyed part of the conversation, was about, Des made the point about self-worth. And I think that leads to me, in my mind, about enrichment activity within our regimes. And also something that Natalie spoke about, which was about considering age, those younger demographics, and making sure that our regime isn't tailored one for all, it's tailored for individual cohorts, provide activity for all that will make their experience of custody as positive as we possibly can be. Not all of it being a needs analysis about education and curriculum, a needs analysis about regime and activities that run around that life.
Great, thank you. Natalie?
So I want to focus for me on prioritising an environment that fosters positive change for prisoners and staff. And just picking up on what Des was just saying there feeds really nicely into this, because what you've described, Des, is exactly what we do in the therapeutic communities. So having an environment that fosters that change, that increases the learning experience for both the prisoners and the staff, somewhere so people feel safe to make changes in their life.
Thank you. Des, have you got any further kind of closing thoughts, reflections, provocations?
I think it's working in prisons isn't easy, as I think we all know. HMPPS, I think, do as best a job as possible in trying to address these issues. But I think it just shows for me the need to try and be a support, a critical friend, as from the voluntary sector and the charity into this space. And to continue to support prisons where possible, especially at a strategic point.
Thank you. And Alice, finally.
I guess my reflection is we've still got quite a long way to go. We know what the evidence says, but actually being able to apply it and support people is challenging. And my thing that I would like people to take away is, if you don't already work in a prison or haven't worked in a prison, please get yourself into a prison and understand what the world is inside. There are some really great charities. Des has obviously here talked about his own, but there are really great charities who need volunteers. And I would strongly encourage you to volunteer and work inside a prison, because I think it gives you a completely different perspective, not just on the criminal justice system, but on society, when you actually spend that time with people in prison.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone, to our panelists and everyone tuning in. Sadly, that is all we've got time for, but a reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available on demand via the Civil Service World website, where you can find details of loads more CSW online and in-person events. Thanks so much again to our panel, and until next time, goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Civil Service World podcast. Do subscribe so you'll get the next episode right in your feed, along with a range of other informed and informative podcasts from the CSW team.